What is the current state of Afghanistan 1 year after the US military withdrawal? Hello, I'm Ahmad Naidu and this is The Heat. August 30th marks the 1 year anniversary since the end of the US's longest war. The occupation of Afghanistan lasted 20 years, cost Washington $2 trillion and killed tens of thousands of people. The Taliban is now back in power and Afghanistan is suffering from a severe humanitarian crisis. CGTN's Callebs, who was recently in Afghanistan, has this report on the state of affairs there.
Bamyan, Afghanistan. Since the late 90s, there has been a hole in the soul of this community. A site carved into the mountains where Buddhas, hundreds of years old, were destroyed by the Taliban government, who labeled them idol worship. There is a new Taliban government in power today, promising a new Afghanistan. Already one of the poorest nations on earth, the government is fighting a new battle: drought, poverty, and widespread hunger. His name is just Zia, a simple man with simple needs, and at the top of that list, putting food on the table for his family.
We can afford food, but it is hard. If I don't work, we cannot eat. I have to work from morning until nightfall.
Lunch is bread and tea. And like so many Afghans, Zia's family faces a daily struggle to eat. 2 of his 3 children were recently hospitalized for malnutrition, including his youngest, who's 4. And very small for that age.
I noticed he was not eating and was getting dizzy and very lazy, not moving very much. We took the younger one to the hospital yesterday and the older one last year.
Packets of nutrient supplements provided by the hospital fill tiny bellies, but it's a short-term fix. A staggering 90% of Afghans are simply not getting enough to eat, and nearly 50% so malnourished, the UN says they suffer from acute hunger. It's been a tough year for the people of Afghanistan, but if you walk through a market like this one in Bamyan, or really any other city, you'll find all kinds of fresh fruit and vegetables. The problem is people don't have enough money to buy it, and they're complaining about high prices. Local officials tell us that about 90% of the people in this area live below the poverty level. And they say, if they're lucky, they'll get meat, vegetables, or fruit about 1 time a month. Without protein and some semblance of a balanced diet, families live off bread, rice, and some potatoes. All too often, their children end up here. It is the malnutrition ward at the Bamyan Provincial Hospital. Doctors see too many infants and children they call wasted.
It means that just we see the skin and the bone like that. Yes, and when we see the face of the children, it is called as a monkey face. The figure is changed there. And when we are removing the clothes of the patient, we can count the ribs.
The crowded waiting room tells the story. Scared mothers and desperately hungry children.
We have about 70% increase in malnutrition among women, 70% in our hospital. About 40% in moderate malnutrition and 30% in severe malnutrition. It is a big increase.
And a big problem.
The
nurse implores this young mother to cook potatoes or chickpeas for her child, but it is a promise the mother cannot make. More than 1 million Afghan infants could die this year because of malnutrition. To put that in perspective, about 250,000 Afghans, civilian and military, died in the 20-year war. Amina Rahmani was married at 20, and by the time she was 24, had 2 children. She says she used to love to gaze at her 15-month-old. Now, Rahmani sees a child wasting away.
When
I look at him now, he is really skinny. I did not eat much when I was pregnant, and he didn't either. I'm afraid his future does not look good.
As for the Taliban's first year in power, she says this has been the worst year for her ever. No jobs, no money, no food, just heartbreak.
This is the worst year, worse than all the others. People are starving. My husband has a shop, but it is not going well. We only eat rice at home, no meat or vegetables. You cannot even find potatoes in our house.
Every province in Afghanistan is suffering, in part because foreign donations used to account for an estimated 70% of Afghanistan's operating budget. That money dried up once the U.S. left and the Taliban seized control. The Taliban says it has brought security to the country, but the harsh reality remains. Few outside nations want anything to do with the Taliban, and as a consequence, many malnourished people. Dr. Ahmad would like to say the Bamiyan region and all of Afghanistan will see brighter days, but he can't.
Actually, the future of Afghanistan is something that is not clear for any Afghan who is living in here, even me and anyone else. Afghanistan security means just to be alive. It means that you would not be killed, to be alive.
Many here have survived generations of fighting. But fighting hunger from within its borders and apathy from outside could prove too much for so many in need.
And Sean Callebs joins us right now. That was quite a heart-wrenching report there, Sean. Now, you've spent a lot of time in Afghanistan during your career. You've worked there as a foreign correspondent, as a journalist. You've also served there as a foreign service officer, as a diplomat. So you know the country pretty well. The United States pulled out a year ago. You've just been back, as we've seen in that report. What is your sense of what has changed in Afghanistan over the past year since that withdrawal?
Well, I think the biggest change to a person is the fact there is security. People can go outside their door. They don't have to worry about being shot. They don't have to worry about roadside bombs for the most part. ISIS-K does have a toehold in the area, and they, of course, try to launch as many attacks as possible in a way basically to embarrass the Taliban or show them that they're still out there. But people all talk about the fact there is security. And all the times I've been there, I've never been able to travel freely around the country. Right when we went there, we met with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they said, it's safe. We can guarantee your safety. We drove to Paktika, the mountains in the southeastern part of the country, really one of the most dangerous areas that had been a frequent site for some of the most hard-fought battles in Afghanistan. We drove through the area of Wardak. Anybody who knows anything about Afghanistan knows that's pretty much the nerve center for the Taliban in the central part of the country. We were stopped in various checkpoints, but always welcomed pretty warmly. But secondly, it has always been a poor country. Now the bottom has dropped out. You heard that family say they don't even have potatoes to eat. So just eating a handful of starch day in and day out, you can imagine what that does to the body, especially young bodies. And the fact the United States has some $7 billion that it is withholding in a Federal Reserve, there's Afghanistan money, and European have about $2 billion. If they would free that up, it would go a long way toward alleviating some kind of crisis. The U.S. says it will only do that once Afghanistan addresses its very serious problem with women's rights, and Afghanistan clearly has no intention of doing that at this point. So it's really, in this one way, people are very happy that there is peace, but in another way, they're just so concerned. And the number of people that pulled me aside privately and said, can you help me get out of the country? And there's absolutely nothing I can do. And it was, it's heartbreaking all the way around. I think you said it best. It's a heart-wrenching story.
Okay, Sean, stay with us. And just a reminder to our viewers that we'll be taking an in-depth look at Afghanistan all week, and you can watch Sean's documentary, Afghanistan, Its People, Its Problems, and that would be screened during our Global Business Show. That's coming up at 8 p.m. Eastern in the United States and 8 a.m. Wednesday, and that's Beijing time. Well, let's bring in the rest of our panel for this evening's show. Here in Washington, D.C., Omar Samad is the former Afghan ambassador to France and Canada and is currently a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center. Brian Becker is the executive director of Act Now to Stop War and End Racism Coalition. Ahmad Shah Mohibi is the founder and president of Rise to Peace. Welcome to all of you to the show. Ambassador, let me start with you. And looking at that report there, as I said, it was a heart-wrenching report to see that. What is your assessment of the situation in Afghanistan now, a year after the U.S. withdrawal?
Well, you have all the figures. Your report pointed to some of the very difficult statistics that the Afghan people are facing. 6 million are facing famine, and 1 million of them are children. 20 million people are food insecure. 25 or more million people need a handout and are living at the line of poverty. This did not have to be this way. Things were not that better before, obviously, at a time when billions of dollars were pouring into Afghanistan. The government wasn't doing a very good job. But the Taliban obviously now are squeezed as well, like the Afghan people. As was pointed out, Afghanistan's central bank assets are frozen. There's a lot of talk about maybe releasing some of that. The international community is asking for more aid. Yesterday, the United Nations Security Council had a very important meeting where China and Russia, basically put the blame on the United States, and the United States asked them to do more. So everyone is starting to blame each other while the Afghans are suffering, and we need a solution fast enough before winter sets in.
All right, Ambassador, as you say, there's a blame game going on right now. But what about the fact that the United States is holding billions of dollars of Afghan money? So are the Europeans. And as Sean Callebs pointed out in his report, releasing that money would go a little way towards alleviating the suffering of people there.
There are a few issues that have created this deadlock, Anand. One of them, obviously, as we all know, has to do with the girls over the teenage girls who have to go to high school in Afghanistan and public schools who have been forbidden. So this has been a contentious issue for the past year, and this has created a political deadlock. The other one has to do with the fact that the Taliban were supposed to be a bit more open with their engagement with other Afghans politically. They haven't been to a large extent, and there is a lot of angst about that. There's also obviously an expectation that they would do well with women and human rights issues and not harass people. So things obviously on one side are problematic. On the other hand, the Taliban claim that they have brought security, as the report said, and countries in the region are feeling very anxious, especially the Russians and the Chinese, the Iranians. There's still a terrorism threat emanating from Afghanistan that the Taliban are trying to control. So overall, there's not enough diplomatic engagement, and we need more diplomacy and less posturing by countries and others who have a stake in Afghanistan.
Right, Brian Becker, there was a piece in the Washington Post written by one of their foreign affairs commentators, Fareed Zakaria, and he said in that piece, he said, and I'm quoting here, "For a long time, Washington's elites saw Afghanistan as the good war, morally justified and sanctioned by the United Nations. People were invested in believing that it was working and maybe blinded themselves to evidence that it wasn't." What do you make of that statement? Do you agree with it?
Yeah, I think it's basically accurate. I mean, after the September 11th attacks, there was so much grief and rage and anger in the country that public opinion was pretty able to be molded. And at first, I think general public opinion was very high, including not just with the elites, but in generally in the population, that the U.S. was doing something in retaliation for the attack. I believe from the beginning the war was completely unnecessary. And I think when you look at the statistics, 250,000 people, according to Brown University, have died, 70,000 of them civilians. And here we are 20 years after the Taliban were basically defeated and offered to surrender, to which Donald Rumsfeld said, we don't negotiate with terrorists. That was November 2001. You have the Taliban in power and the U.S. using women's rights as a pretext to starve women. I mean, how can you care about women and girls and deprive women and girls and others in Afghanistan of their money, which they need in order to buy food? I mean, it's such a reckless and hypocritical position on the part of the U.S. So if it was supposedly a good war once, which I personally never believed, I was an opponent of the war, but here we are 20 years later, the U.S. lost, spent $2 trillion, 250,000 Afghans dead, and the American solution, because it cares so much about the women and girls of Afghanistan, is to starve them to death? I mean, really? This policy has to change.
And it's just not the United States, is it, Brian? Because when the United States invaded Afghanistan, it did so with NATO forces at its side. These NATO countries, especially the European countries, also holding Afghan money, are not doing anything to alleviate that situation as well.
No, this is a war. This is an ongoing economic war, sort of a genocide in slow motion against poor people and babies and the elderly, the most vulnerable in society, who can't survive just on a starch diet, who can't survive without clean drinking water. So the rich and powerful countries of the world who, sort of righteously went to war for 20 years under the banner of NATO, seem to be perfectly content with killing Afghans. And when you deprive Afghans of their own money, it's theft, it's international thievery. When you deprive Afghans of their own money, don't allow Afghanistan to integrate into the world economy, and say you're doing it for a righteous cause, you say the price is worth it, as Madeleine Albright said about killing Iraqi kids. No, the price is not worth it. And as a matter of fact, the United States and Europe are culpable right now for a crime against humanity.
Ahmad Shah Mohibi, the United States Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, that's a person who oversees how the money is being spent there, issued a report on the 20 years of United States occupation, and that report said in part, and I'm quoting here again, it said, if the goal was to rebuild and leave behind a country that can sustain itself and pose little threat to U.S. national security interests, the overall picture is bleak. Question is, Ahmad Shah Mohibi, is Afghanistan now in a worse state than it was when the United States first invaded?
Well, there has been gains and achievements that, of course, it has directly impacted the life of people despite the Taliban takeover. We see a huge generation of Afghans well connected to the world, and that is thankful to the U.S. and the international community. But when we're looking at Afghanistan, we look into the SIGAR report, it tells us one specific thing, and that is the huge corruption in Afghanistan and how we put billions of dollars in the hands of wrong people, and how that money was miscalculated and it was not put into investment. We look into today, look in the former government, people were dying of food starvation too. Maybe not in Kabul city, on close to the presidential palace, but in the districts. So people were angry, they have grievances and they have food. And then we see much more in a higher level right now under the Taliban regime. So we look into the trillions and billions spent in Afghanistan could have been better invested in the country, in the infrastructure, in the development sector. But sadly, I would say it's just because we poured money and we have no transparency, accountability, and with the wrong people in the wrong hands. And that led to the whole collapse. I mean, corruption fits into terrorism. And we look into right now what the Taliban are doing. They're after the billions of dollars that has been frozen in the assets. And so it's a deadlock, as the other panelists were saying. So it's just, I would say, the whole nation building was not the purpose of the United States. And that's what President Biden said last July before the collapse. We didn't go to Afghanistan to nation build. So when you say, when a president of the United States, a sitting president says that, that means the whole war was to just go kill Osama bin Laden and come back. But then started staying in Afghanistan. Generals didn't know what to do. Soldiers didn't know what to do. And then there was Afghan contractors and so-called leaders just benefiting from the war. And in the Western world, all these big corporates and big companies were just printing money off the Afghan blood and the US soldiers dying in Afghanistan. So that has been the whole backbone of what happened in the past 20 years. Just no accountability, corruption, and just no grand strategy what to do.
Sean Callebs, of course, the Taliban seized power very quickly after the United States withdrawal. Now, during your trip to Afghanistan, you talked with Taliban officials. What are they saying about the future of the country?
It's interesting because they said before anything, they must get the nation secure. Any new leader of a country would do that, especially with ISIS-K within the borders as well. And they say once they can take care of security within the nation, then they can focus on all these other issues. The question is, there's just not time for that, especially with winter coming, as your guests have pointed out, and the fact that there is this food crisis globally, chiefly driven by the fighting going on in Ukraine. Last December, last January, last February, there were huge concerns, but the world kind of came together and was able to bail out Afghanistan. It's going to be very difficult for them to do that again this time. The Taliban says it wants to have peaceful relations with other countries, but right now it's viewed as a pariah state by so many of other nations, whether rightfully or wrongfully. That's just the way it is. And to me, I really want to focus on one thing that your guest talked about, the amount of money that was wasted. Clearly, the U.S. took its eye off the ball at some point in this ongoing war. When I was working there in the diplomatic service, one of my grantees basically stole $650,000. I went to our security officials and I wanted to go take equipment back, and they said, you can't. And I was just, dumbfounded. And he said, why are you so worked up? It's only $650,000. And that's when I thought, wow, this is, they're just printing money. And when President Ghani left, SIGAR, the special investigation for the reconstruction, some $100 million went missing that day. So, I mean, the amount of money that was simply wasted that could have gone to help people. And the people in that country know that. They know it very well. They know its own leaders got wealthy. They know contractors got wealthy. And they know the United States came in and they are viewed as occupiers. That's all anybody referred to the U.S. To me when I was there. They were occupying. They were here. They occupied 20 years. They occupied. There's, of course, disappointment the way the U.S. left, but there's a lot more disappointment that they were there that long.
Ambassador, you were in Afghanistan when the Taliban was in power, and then, of course, you served as a diplomat after the Taliban was driven from power. What is your feeling? Has the country gone full circle? Is it back to where it was 20 years ago? And, I mean, how can you break that deadlock where the Afghan people are really being held hostage because of intransigence on the parts of Western governments?
Well, there's intransigence on all sides. Part of what we are seeing is sort of a reminder of the past, but part of it is not. It's today's reality. It's a totally different environment inside the country, around Afghanistan, and look at, globally, we are in a very different place compared to 20 years ago. I think that there are a lot of lessons that have to be learned. Your other guest alluded to some of the biggest problems that we faced in Afghanistan. I don't know if those lessons are being learned or not, but as far as Afghanistan is concerned, I think that there needs to be continued calibrated engagement on the humanitarian front to make sure that the Afghan people do not face starvation and chaos and in a situation that would be untenable. At the same time, we need to engage the Taliban on discussing with more, I think, seriousness the issues that divide us, but we need a different framework. And we need the Afghans to step in. We need the Islamic world to step in. We need the region also to maybe refrain from playing great power rivalries and maybe try to focus on resolving Afghanistan's issues.
Brian Becker, the international community is, of course, not recognizing the Taliban as the government of Afghanistan, as the representative of the Afghan people. I mean, what impact does that have on the country's ability to emerge from all these decades of war?
Yeah, this is a form of collective punishment with the fig leaf of legality. By not recognizing the reality, the actual reality that the Taliban is the government of Afghanistan, then other countries, especially the more powerful countries that are really ruling the roost, can turn away and can say, well, we don't have any partner there. We don't have any entity that we can deal with. I mean, it's pure politics. When China had its revolution in 1949, it lost its seat at the United Nations and at the Security Council until 1971 because the U.S. policy was based on animus and hostility towards China at the time. I mean, when we think about it, before 2001, before the September 11th attacks, before the October 2001 invasion of Afghanistan by NATO, Taliban was in power. And the United States had relations with the Taliban. It wasn't completely isolated. I mean, George W. Bush was hosting Taliban, as were other big government leaders, because there were important geostrategic and economic interests, especially regarding pipelines. So the Afghanistan government under the Taliban before, they weren't a complete pariah state. I think they were a reactionary political force. I hate their politics and their cultural and social orientation.
Right.
But this is collective punishment because the U.S. and NATO lost the war, and now they want to punish the Afghan people and use the pretext of women's rights and girls' rights as a way to starve the country and say, look, you think you were going to be better off when the occupation ended? Yeah. Well, no, you're going to be worse off because we're going to make sure you're worse off. I think that's the real dynamic here.
Right. Ahmad Mohibi, I've just got about a minute left, under a minute, in fact. The short-term outlook is very bleak as well. In fact, the United Nations says Afghans need $770 million to survive the coming winter months. It doesn't seem like that money is going to be forthcoming. What are Afghans going to do? I mean, what are they facing?
Just accepting the facts, and Afghanistan has been a poor country for several decades, and just living off the livestock and whatever they have to survive. And also encourage international donors and organizations to engage in Afghanistan. Is going one of the worst economic crises in the world right now, and with 500 million living the acute hunger and more children. So that's what Afghanistan has been. We look into the 1980s war, 1990s, to the present day. It has been this cycle of war, prolonged war, but the Afghans are paying the price. I think it's just a matter of they understand how to live, and that's how it's been used, part of the Afghan culture.
Okay. And that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. I'm Ahmad in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching another edition of The Heat, and we'll see you again soon.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives.